Good morning. Good evening if you're in the United States or North America. I'm Michael Green. I'm the incoming CEO of the U.S. Studies Center at the University of Sydney. I'll be there in June. Right now, I'm in Ames, Iowa, traveling in the United States. But pleased to be joining you to talk about the implications of the Russian invasion of Ukraine for NATO, and for NATO's overall strategic concept and relations with Asia-Pacific partners and allies, including, of course, Australia, but also Japan, Korea. The significance of the Ukraine invasion for how Europe and the United States might think differently about contingencies not discussed much before in the transatlantic context, contingencies like Taiwan or the Korean Peninsula. The future of the transatlantic relationship. There are a lot of gears turning in the international system now because of Vladimir Putin's brutal and unjustified attack on Ukraine, because of the Ukrainians really inspiring resistance. And you see nations rallying in different ways, but you also see other counter trends. Much of the world that is not in the G7 or the OECD is ambivalent, or in some cases even sympathetic with the Russians. So it's a complicated story. And right at the heart of this is the transatlantic relationship and the NATO alliance. And as I said, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, our friends and allies in the Indo-Pacific. To try to pull all this together, we're calling on one of our best at the U.S. Studies Center, Dr. Gorana Grgic, who is the expert on NATO at the center. She's appointed senior lecturer at the Department of Government and International Relations at the United States Studies Center at the University of Sydney. She's taught undergraduate and postgraduate units in politics and foreign policy, world politics, ethnic politics, international organizations, and interdisciplinary studies at the University of Sydney. She's been a visiting scholar at Harvard, at the Minda de Gunsberg Center for European Studies, and a 2021 Partners Across the Globe Fellow at the NATO Defense College. But before we begin our discussion, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia. The University of Sydney stands on the land of the Grgic people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which you are on and pay respects to their elders, past, present, and future. And because I'm in Iowa, let me also pay respect to the Ilini, Otoe, and Dakota Sioux, something we don't do in the United States, but I wish we did more, as our friends in Australia do. So Gorana, welcome. Let's get right into it. We'll take questions from you. You can send the questions to Gorana or to me in the Q&A function. This will be 70% me quizzing Gorana and 30% her quizzing me back on East Asian allies. But let's start first with NATO, Gorana. There's a NATO summit at the end of June. NATO is working on a new strategic concept. How do you think the Ukraine crisis is changing the orientation, the dynamics, obviously the composition of NATO, and what might we expect in the strategic concept?
Thank you, Mike, and good morning and good evening to all of you who are joining us now live and also reporting from the Gadigal land. I am at the University of Sydney at the moment, and we eagerly await for you to come here so we can do these things in person rather than via Zoom. But to get to your question on where NATO is at the moment and what might be coming up and what we should be looking over the next couple of weeks and months, really, because there are some very big developments that we are going to see in terms of the alliance. So first of all, if we are just to take what was on the agenda for NATO anyway, was the Madrid summit that is going to take place at the very last week of June, so in a month's time. And that summit is actually a very important one for NATO because for the first time in over a decade, NATO will unveil its new strategic concept. So basically a kind of guiding set of principles and assessment for where it is that the alliance should be going and what it should be doing in the forthcoming years. And this is important because we need to understand that actually there have been some pushes for NATO to actually figure out what it is that it is and what it's supposed to do that have come even prior to Russia's invasion of invasion of Ukraine in February. And they were important for NATO because we can only go back to, the Trump administration, where there was a lot of these kind of debates basically about the utility of NATO for the United States, but there were also serious questions about its capability and value from the European side. And, you go back to President Macron, who has recently been re-elected as president of France, who has wondered if the alliance is brain dead. So there was that kind of chatter. At the institutional level within NATO, we had Secretary Stoltenberg launch the so-called NATO 2030 agenda, where again, spurred by the various developments around the world, whether they are, at the level of kind of interstate competition or in terms of the emerging technologies or the impact that some of the transnational issues like climate change have on the alliance and its ability to project influence, that were basically motivating this sort of idea that NATO really needs to think a bit harder and come up with a strategic concept that is going to address all of these things, right? And so I'm going to wrap this up very shortly, but just to say that then the lead up to the Madrid summit was really meant to be a kind of road of NATO's a kind of strategic introspection, of reflection, and then obviously Russia invaded Ukraine on February of 24th, and all of these things that we thought that NATO is going to feature a lot more in its strategic concept around things like crisis management or cooperative security, on making some statements that are going to be, much more focused on NATO becoming more global and political. I wouldn't say that they've gone away, but they have certainly been deprioritized. And NATO these days, as we get closer towards the Madrid summit, is going to be much more about defense and deterrence, which is basically what I would call the original factory settings for the alliance, why it was created back in 1949.
The original factory settings did not include Sweden and Finland. What do you expect from the NATO summit in terms of their bid for membership? And do you think the Turkey problem will be sorted out by then?
That's absolutely right. So back in 49, it was only 12 member states originally. Today, we have NATO that has 30 member states. Last couple of rounds of enlargement were actually very, very far from European North. It was in the Balkans region, something that is kind of an object of my long-term study. But yes, certainly what we have seen and what we can't really overestimate is the significance of Sweden and Finland. I think I've just also devised a portmanteau of Swinland. Okay, so they have obviously signaled their readiness to join the alliance because, and willingness really, because of the changed threat assessment. And now obviously we have to understand about one thing about NATO, which is that it operates on the principle of consensus of all member states, which means that unless everyone agrees, nothing has been agreed upon. And so far, obviously, we've heard some of the objections that have been coming out of Ankara. They are primarily serving domestic politics purposes, where we know that the genesis of this sort of objection to the entry of these two states has to do with Turkey's treatment and relations with its Kurdish minority, but also with the Kurdish diaspora, of which there is quite a significant number in these two Nordic states. But ultimately, what I think will prevail, there might be some concessions that Sweden and Finland will be giving, or at least on a symbolic level. But I think that at the moment, the sort of pulse of the alliance is such where outright opposition to Sweden and Finland joining would basically translate into being, kind of helping Putin's cause and Russia's cause. And I think in that context, probably the kind of institutional balance of power and the fact that overall across the alliance, there is a lot more agreement these days on the utility and need for NATO to be strong, that's much greater than the obstructions coming from a single state. But that's not to say that, we aren't going to see these sort of tussles, and there is certainly a lot that's going on in the background that isn't getting reported in the lead up to the summit. But I would say more importantly, what we've seen from the member states so far, at least the other 29, more or less everyone has committed to fast tracking the applications for membership. Obviously, we know that this needs to go through the kind of treaty ratification process in the legislatures of the member states. And so far, even out of the United States, where we know what the situation is like on the Hill, there's not a lot of agreement on a lot of matters, but when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to support for Ukraine, there has been a lot of bipartisanship.
So when NATO expanded to include the Balkans, tell me if it doesn't square with your deep research on that subject, but it seems to me that stabilized a part of Europe that was historically unstable and a real vacuum and a real magnet for great power competition. But the Balkans members, and same for the Baltic, didn't bring significantly new capabilities. But when you're talking about Finland and Sweden, you're talking about some real capabilities for NATO, right? This is not just stabilizing a part of Europe. This is adding obviously more borders, but also the Swedes and especially the Finns are extremely capable military powers, aren't they? I mean, this is a huge onside goal for Putin, it seems.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So if we think about the last three waves of NATO enlargement in 2009, 2017, 2020, NATO received 4 extra member states that have in one way or another had the experience of protracted ethnic conflicts that have been actually security consumers during the 90s. So we are talking about Croatia, Albania, Montenegro, and North Macedonia. So obviously they differ in their experiences in the 90s, but certainly this was an area where NATO actually, for the first time in the post-Cold War history and in its existence, actually was deployed in a capacity that had to do with crisis management, which is a different sort of competence if you think about it to, say, what I referred to earlier, the defense and deterrence, which is core to NATO's existence. And this was in fact enshrined in NATO's strategic concept at the end of the 90s, in 99, when NATO made its core task to be crisis management, and then later on also added cooperative security a decade later. So these Balkan states veritably were security consumers. NATO accession was meant to essentially help them forge a path towards Euro-Atlantic integration. There is this joke that, US likes to get to the final destination, European, and so it kind of in spearheading NATO, it helps countries get there, whereas European Union is much more about the journey. And we know that these countries, out of these four, for instance, only Croatia is a member state of the European Union, and so in terms of the Euro-Atlantic integration, NATO was seen as a much sort of easier way to integrate these countries than, say, the process of EU enlargement, which is very much stalled when it comes to the Western Balkans 6, as they are referred to. Now, on Sweden and Finland and what they bring, NATO, you're absolutely right. They are bringing huge capacity and capability to add. They are security producers. They are arms exporters, for instance, arms manufacturers. They have that on the capability side. They have both the materiel and the personnel, but also from the geostrategic perspective, from if you just look at the map of Europe, what NATO is now getting is basically a consolidation of the Nordic space. Obviously, I hope that this comes as no news. Iceland, Denmark, Norway, all member states in that kind of Nordic ring. Now, Sweden and Finland joining NATO closes that part, the kind of hole that there was for historic reasons. Obviously, we know the kind of whole issue of Finlandization, right, and neutrality, also Swedish foreign policy that was predicated on non-alignment for the past 2 centuries. But now, again, as I said, threat assessment is significantly different. And this means that now the NATO border with Russia is going to extend by some 1,300 kilometers, which, if you were Vladimir Putin and your calculations were to try to prevent NATO from basically coming closer to Russia's borders, this seems to be a massive backfiring and something that certainly not a lot of us who follow what goes on in NATO were expecting. If you just look at some of the public opinion polls in these countries, in Finland early this year, that support for NATO accession prior to Russia's invasion was less than 1/3. These days, 3/4 of Finns support accession. Nearly 60% of Swedes are also supporting it. So a huge shift in terms of the public opinion that we can't overstate how significant February 24th has been for Europe.
In 20 years, when scholars talk about Finlandization, it's going to mean something completely different. 180 degrees different from how you and I studied it and used the word over the last decades, in my case, decades. The other thing it seems to me is Finland and Sweden joining Norway and Denmark and other Nordic countries in NATO really beefs up the focus on the Arctic and an Arctic security, which I'm guessing is not a huge theme in Australia, but in the US and Canada, in Norway and NATO countries in Alaska, it's a big theme as China now, builds a Silk Road to the Arctic, and Russia is dramatically expanding its military capabilities. And I have not seen much about that, but I would imagine this is also going to sort of reinforce the most northern flank of what NATO thinks about in terms of security. The last 20 years have been pretty rough for the transatlantic relationship. I was in the Bush White House for the first 4.5 years of the Bush administration. So I was in charge of Asia. My job was relatively easy because we had very strong ties with our Asian allies, and President Bush personally had strong connections to John Howard and Prime Minister Koizumi and others. But Europe was tough, and the Congress changed the menu in the cafeteria because of French criticism of the Iraq War, and famously got rid of French fries and called them freedom fries. And I remember Georgetown students marching outside of the French embassy wearing chicken suits. It was a pretty tough time. We kind of recovered actually in the second term of the Bush administration. And then, the Trump administration was particularly rough in transatlantic relations. And, Donald Trump's former Secretary of Defense and other senators have come out and said, if he had been really elected, he wanted to pull out of NATO and Korea. So we dodged a bullet. But the Biden administration had its own very rough patch with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, where, as you know, European leaders were more than unhappy. They were distraught that the U.S. didn't coordinate that, didn't communicate, didn't handle it well. And now it seems like all of that is gone. I've heard European diplomats in Washington say the Biden administration's handling of the diplomacy on Ukraine has been almost perfect. And I've heard Asian allies from Taiwan to Japan, and Australia talk about how effective this has been. So my question for you is this: is the transatlantic relationship, is NATO, transatlantic NATO, on a upward trajectory that we can feel very confident now because of what Putin has done? Or do we have to worry that Donald Trump could come back, that Marine Le Pen, could come back, that anti-Europe and anti-European politicians in the US, anti-NATO politicians in France or other parts of Europe might come back? Or does this put us in a whole new chapter where we're in a much stronger position for transatlantic relations?
And maybe it would be too easy of an answer to say we just don't know. It's too early to tell, I would say. But what I would say, and thank you for sharing some of those personal anecdotes, and certainly they do go towards this line around transatlantic relations being mired with crises, that the kind of history of transatlantic relations is one of different crises, right? And that's not a very original thought. Stanley Hoffman of Harvard University, who was a great scholar of Europe-US relations, wrote extensively about that back in the day. And, we go back to the US presidents as early as Kennedy's administration, for instance, who were equally critical and sounded almost Trumpian in their derision of European allies who weren't spending enough on their defense and who were being forever clients of the US and so on. He didn't quite put it in those terms of being free riders and so on, but certainly some of that sentiment has been there for quite some time. So I would say, if we think about, in terms of more kind of longue durée and kind of historic trends, there are elements there that will say that, US and Europe, as much as they are kind of natural partners, at the same time, there are still different kinds of entities, right? And also that's another thing that we have to think about when we talk about transatlantic relations, is that US deals with different types of actors in Europe. And that's the famous and alleged kind of statement by Henry Kissinger of who do you call when you want to talk to Europe, right? And is this the sort of, call that you are placing to the European Commission or the President of the EU Council, or for that matter on security matters to the Secretary General of NATO, or do you talk to the kind of peers and colleagues in Paris, Berlin, London, etc., and especially how that got complicated as well with Brexit, where the kind of traditional axis of transatlantic alliance, the one between UK and US, is no longer serving that sort of purpose within the European Union for obvious reasons, and UK's exit out of the EU. So that's one thing there. I would say, in terms of where we might be heading in terms of NATO unity and kind of harmony that we've seen over the past couple of months, that is something that has really surprised everyone, myself included. I think that, for all of the reasons that you mentioned. So last year's sort of fallout over the US withdrawal from Afghanistan that Europeans were scathing of, really. But then to add that insult to injury, just a month later, US unveiled AUKUS agreement as well, which I'm sure we'll touch on in just a little bit, which made Europeans, or a lot of Europeans at least, in terms of the kind of elite level chatter, very disappointed and wondering, if Biden just has nicer words and pretends to do things in partnership with others, but that the US is more or less throwing Europe under the bus, or not consulting on a lot of these important matters. So this turn really, and I think what the Biden administration has really done very well and very skillfully and consciously is to stress how much it has consulted and coordinated with European allies and partners, whether it comes to provision of humanitarian aid, of military aid, in terms of rolling out sanctions regime and so on. So really we see a lot of cooperation across the Atlantic at the moment. Now, in terms of longevity of these sort of shifts, it will depend a lot also on the domestic politics side of things, right? So as you already mentioned, what if we get a different president from the Republican Party, if that president happens to be Donald Trump in 24? What happens if Europe really starts freezing the coming winter? So currently, obviously, Northern Hemisphere is approaching summer. It is already pretty hot. The kind of demands maybe for gas aren't as great, even though we know that gas can also be used for electricity that powers those air conditions. But as commodities prices start rising, as the domestic buy-in and support for the kind of efforts and economic warfare, quite frankly, start waning, what happens then? Who is going to make sure that sort of unity and convergence is maintained, and how will that be done? There are serious discussions that are being had around that, but again, I would just caution everyone who at this point says that they're absolutely certain that this is the kind of golden age is coming, or that the doomsdays are coming. There are just a lot of factors that are floating in the air. But obviously we know as well that these kinds of crises are what propels usually a lot of institutional innovation and kind of opens up a lot of doors for cooperation in a way that couldn't have been seen before. Again, and we'll refer back to the imminent enlargement of NATO to the north as one of the examples of that.
Yeah, one of the sources of tension in the transatlantic relationship has been the U.S. Pronounced pivot to Asia, most notably when Hillary Clinton published an article in November 2011 in Foreign Policy declaring a pivot to Asia, written by Kurt Campbell, who's now the senior coordinator for Indo-Pacific in the Biden White House, and with AUKUS, as you mentioned. The reality is, most of American history, Europe has dominated our foreign policy, and Britain was the privileged ally. And in World War II, 70% of the fighting material went to Europe in the war. During the Korean War, when Americans and Australians were fighting and dying in the Korean Peninsula, the U.S. Army sent more divisions to Europe to reinforce NATO than it sent to Korea to fight in an actual war. And there are other examples as well. But beginning around the time of the pivot in 2011, in public opinion polls, for the first time, Americans began saying Asia is more important than Europe. The German Marshall Fund, for decades did this polling because they could point to it and say, look, Americans think Europe's more important than any other part of the world. And their own polls in 2010 started showing Americans thought Asia was more important. This has not been comfortable for our European allies at all. And it didn't just begin in 2011. Rich Armitage, who's a good friend and mentor, was the senior Asia official in the Reagan administration in the Pentagon, and he described a delegation from the House of Lords who came to see him, and he described America's strategy in Asia. And he tells this story all the time, but this representative from the House of Lords said, "Young man, to us, Asia is the other side of the moon." So this has been a source of real tension. The NATO allies have been used to having sort of privileged position in U.S. foreign policy, and that's shifting. Kurt Campbell's office in the White House is 3 times larger than the Europe office in the NSC. So AUKUS in part happened because, it wasn't a fair fight. But it seems to me the Ukraine invasion has maybe dissipated some of that Europe or Asia, which child do you love more, America, your NATO allies or your Asian allies? It seems to some extent maybe the Ukraine invasion has dissipated that because this is a global event and Asian allies have stepped up. Japan, Australia, Singapore stepped up. Korea, now under President Yoon, is really stepping up. And you can see this is a global event, a global security crisis. So it also seems like that source of tension may be going away, and there's more of a Indo-Pacific, transatlantic common sense of security. It's nascent in some ways. What do you think? Is this a temporary phenomenon, or do you think this is I'm asking you to predict the future? As the famous American baseball player Yogi Berra said, prediction is difficult, especially about the future. But predict about the future. Do you think this is nascent, or does this really the sort of, as our Chinese friends would say, the forces of history?
This is such a great question. And I don't mean that in the sort of usual space filler and time filler, let me compose my thoughts now. I am actually very interested and have been a student of the sort of idea of transplanting the transatlantic cooperation into the Indo-Pacific. And you're absolutely right. If we go back a decade ago, and you referred to that famous article from Foreign Policy by Hillary Clinton that basically launched a pivot. And then from my end and kind of interest of what the responses in Europe were at the time. For instance, Javier Solana, who used to be the Secretary General of NATO, as well as the EU's High Rep for Foreign Policy and Security Affairs, who penned a response which said that this is a perilous pivot away from Europe, and that basically the kind of, and obviously we know that Obama administration went into a lot of PR damage control and said that this is not a pivot, this is a rebalance, we're just rebalancing, but Europe, we still love you, and so on. And you alluded already to some of the kind of touchiness of these issues. But what I really see over the past couple of years, and really what has been highlighted by the fact that we have a conventional high-intensity war going on in Europe, is how interconnected the European and Indo-Pacific theaters are. I think that this is a very big sort of paradigm change, if you want, where, again, a decade ago, it wasn't seen as such. But given the fact that we have seen now for years, China and Russia really coming together in a way that, obviously makes a lot of people wonder if this is true love or just a marriage of convenience. But certainly the fact that even just, 2 or so weeks before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they basically issued this statement on their strategic partnership, almost, that reads as a kind of informal alliance that has made a lot of people, both in Washington and in European capitals realize that you can't necessarily do things by yourself, because of the nature of these two states where they sit in terms of, the geopolitics, that it is important to cooperate across these two theaters. And I would just point to the fact that, again, this is not something that necessarily then just got accentuated by Russia's invasion and the ensuing war, but also the fact that, for instance, in Europe, over the past 4 or so years now, we have seen a growing interest in the Indo-Pacific, right? So the kind of main propeller behind this sort of interest has been France, for obvious reasons, because it sees itself actually as one of the resident powers in the Indo-Pacific because of its possessions in the South Pacific. But then it managed to twist the arm somewhat of the German Foreign Federal Office. So Germany also published its Indo-Pacific strategy. We then saw Netherlands publish its own, Britain, as part of its new sort of role on the world stage away from the European Union, unveiled its Indo-Pacific tilt. And actually the European Union, just a day after AUKUS was announced, published its own Indo-Pacific strategy. It even has an envoy that is in charge of the Indo-Pacific affairs. And actually, having just talked to that person a couple of days ago, because he's in Australia, you wouldn't believe that, I was told that at the moment there is quite a vibrant dialogue that goes on between Brussels and Washington at the level of Deputy Secretary of State when it comes to coordinating efforts and cooperating on matters of Indo-Pacific, whether it's security or economic cooperation. Particularly kind of a big ticket item here, cooperation on infrastructure diplomacy. So I would say, again, I know that this is a kind of long way to get there, but I don't think that this is necessarily going to go away. And again, a major sort of change is one where Europeans are increasingly looking into the Indo-Pacific, realizing they have also hardened their line on China, right? So here we have a lot more convergence than we had just a decade ago, where a European Union thought that it could just go and kind of pretend that there are no security implications of growing interdependence with China. But that changed very much when it published its 2019 strategic outlook on China, where it actually said that China is both an economic partner, but also a systemic rival. So these are much bigger and greater forces that I think will persist long after, hopefully, things start calming down in Europe. And I say that with a sort of, side of me knowing that we could also be seeing a very protracted conflict and a grind in Ukraine.
In 2005, the EU was moving to lift the arms embargo on China that had been put in place after Tiananmen. It was a crisis in transatlantic relations. Most people don't think about it now, but it was a big crisis because China, the PRC, was promulgating the anti-secession law, which would have made it a matter of Chinese law to use force against Taiwan to prevent secession. So at a time when China was about to pass in the National People's Consultative Congress, an act declaring the right, which they always had, of course, but nevertheless telegraphing the right to use force against Taiwan, the EU is going to lift the arms embargo and make it possible to sell weapons to China. So we had a huge transatlantic spat. And my small contribution at the time in my position as the person running Asia at the NSC was to propose a transatlantic dialogue on China and Asia. And I'm pretty sure that's where it started. And it was on again, off again, but we had never talked about it strategically in a serious way between the US and Europe. When we did, frankly, for the next 10, 15 years, it was all about China. It was very hard for Washington to get European friends with a few exceptions, to think about Japan, Australia, Korea. That's very different now. The Japanese relationship with Europe is just blossoming. So is Australia's. The Indo-Pacific strategies, it was Japan and Abe Shinzo who promoted Indo-Pacific, but it really was, our friend Rory Metcalf's construct in Australia years before that. So there really is more and more of a convergence, not just on Asia, but with Asian allies, which is a really important development. The other thing is, I think Ukraine has shown that the crisis caused by an attack on a free people, by an authoritarian state, can allow for the mobilization of democracies around the world. And Taiwan sees this. The Japanese Foreign Minister Hashiyoshi Masa said Japan must act on Ukraine because China's watching. And I think the demonstration effect has been pretty powerful. It would be harder to mobilize European economic pressure on China in a crisis on Taiwan or over at Taiwan than it has been to organize Asian pressure on Russia. But you could do it, and this demonstrates that. And I think that enhances deterrence in the Western Pacific as well. So it's a really quite significant development. Let me ask you one last kind of almost provocative question, but in Washington right now, there's a real buzz, and a real buzz is not the right word. There's a real alarm that Putin might possibly use low-yield nuclear weapons against the Ukrainians. It would be a colossally stupid and self-defeating move, but so was this entire invasion, as we saw with the damage done to Russia's economy and the expansion of NATO. How would low-yield nuclear weapons use, a threshold not crossed ever in Europe, and only once before in history, of course, with Japan, how would that transform NATO? Would we start seeing what we saw in the 80s with the deployment of tactical US nuclear weapons? I mean, what on the nuclear side, what does that do? And I would think it would also be another thing that would link Asian and European allies around security problems.
I mean, if we talk about the invasion as a game changer, then such a thing would certainly be, something that obviously there is contingency planning that has been done, right? And I have no doubt of that. I'm not privy, obviously, or haven't been privy to those discussions, so I wouldn't want to weigh in on those sorts of things. But I would say that one thing that is really concerning is the way that this has been almost normalized in terms of the discussions around the war, right? That we could expect this, that, there is not a lot that could deter Russia at this point, given that actually the use of tactical nukes is part of their military doctrine as well. So Russia has been talking and writing about this in some of the key strategic documents for quite some time. But when you ask what it would do for the alliance, I think that already what we are seeing is a mobilization that we haven't seen at any point following the Cold War. But this would be something that definitely would make NATO act in a way that obviously would find a sort of response to the kind of level of impact and the threat that poses. So one thing that maybe, just not to leave us all down, and maybe just to kind of look at where the Russian sort of force posture has been these days, and if there have been major sort of changes when it comes to its the kind of placement of the weapons that are capable of the launch of low intensity nuclear strikes. We, at least from what my understanding has been, we haven't seen a major shift, but it hasn't doesn't mean that we wouldn't be able to see it as well. So again, in terms of a game changer, absolutely. And again, I think then it would make a case for the need to have NATO for decades to come. And really, you know, just probably what it would also do is that it would close the door for a lot of the kind of voices that are still in the middle of all of this, saying you need to find some ground with Russia, right? To offer it some sort of off-ramp, to come to some sort of settlement. I think that it would really slam shut that door for years to come, if not decades.
Watch this space. There's a lot of nervousness about this in Washington right now. Low probability, but very high consequences,
Yes.
not out of the question. I have some really good questions, Gorana. Let me turn to them. His Excellency Darius Degudis, Ambassador of Lithuania to Australia, notes that he is extremely pleased NATO is enlarging to include Finland and Sweden. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is altering the geopolitical history. His question is, could NATO expect some Indo-Pacific countries, especially Australia, with its very strong pro-NATO stance, could you see some Asian allies joining NATO in some force, in some way? And Doug Reid from Boeing Australia asks a question which is along the same lines. Since Australia is an individual partnership and cooperation program member, what more might Australia do to support NATO? So in the near term, to answer Mr. Reid, what can Australia do with NATO? And thinking out of the box, you know, is there a possibility of other countries, even in the Indo-Pacific, joining NATO? I've heard very senior former cabinet members in Japan, for example, privately float the idea of a NAPTO, North Atlantic Pacific Treaty Organization. Sounds fanciful, but so did Finland and Sweden joining NATO 2 years ago or so. So how far does this go? This participation with NATO even beyond the North Atlantic?
Yeah, and thank you for those questions. And it's great to see we have also good sort of following among the diplomatic corps. And Lithuania actually is one of the countries that has been most vocal when it comes to managing relations with China, in really swinging its support towards Taiwan, for instance, over the past couple of years. So just to get back to that question of NATO's partnerships, and I'm glad to see that again some of the audience are very much versed in the acronym soup that is the world of NATO partnerships. So basically that's absolutely right. So NATO has had these individually tailored partnerships, which are the IPCPs, so Individual Partnership and Cooperation Program, that it has with the likes of Australia, but also the other Asia Pacific Four, as it refers to Japan, New Zealand, Korea, and Australia. And at the moment, it's doing something that's a bit more comprehensive, both in terms of the depth and the breadth of cooperation, which it hopes to release somewhere around the upcoming summit. And these are new programs called the ITPP, which are the individually tailored partnership programs. So basically, they're much more detailed when it comes to activities around which NATO will cooperate with partner states like Australia. And where we see a lot of convergence these days is around issues such as emerging and disruptive technologies, countering disinformation, maritime security, building resilience, addressing climate change as well. Now, especially I think relevant given the change of government here in Australia, and some other issues, whether it's cyberspace and so on. So I would say that these days there is a lot more of again sort of propelling factors, the kind of push factors factors on both sides, both NATO and on part of these individual countries to deepen and to broaden their relationship. Now, in terms of augmenting or enlarging NATO to really become a global alliance, I think that there aren't necessarily plans for that anytime soon. But I have heard some discussions and kind of, again, you referred to some of these formats around, for instance, AUKUS Plus, and what this could be, is the kind of multilateralism that we see with AUKUS, with Quad, the best way to move forward, or would it be wiser to try to make it more comprehensive, and what are the trade-offs there? And obviously understanding that there are different levels of ambition around this region in particular, around the kind of security cooperation. But Mike, I would also be interested in your take around Japanese and Korean responses, whether we are seeing some difference there in North Asia as a result of Russia's invasion, or in general, kind of more longer term strategic shifts when it comes to their cooperation with NATO.
I think for Japan, this is a core foreign policy objective to strengthen the Trans-Pacific and Transatlantic alliance connection. And for example, during the Trump years, the G7 didn't function well because Macron and Justin Trudeau in particular fought with Donald Trump constantly for good reasons. But the Japanese Prime Minister Abe Shinzo was constantly arguing with his European allies, be patient with Mr. Trump, don't blow the G7. On technology, Japan has pushed for a trilateral US, EU, Japan trade ministers technology dialogue. And in Japan, there's enthusiasm and support for AUKUS. So for Japan's overall strategy of expanding and externalizing partnerships to deal with a rising and more, assertive China, NATO is a logical partner. But I think you're right that, to answer Ambassador Darius Dugutz's question, I think a collective security arrangement is unlikely because, of course, NATO is a collective security arrangement. And if Japan and Australia and Korea join NATO, that would obligate Lithuania and now Finland and Sweden to help defend them if they got attacked by, say, China or North Korea. And I don't think that geopolitics are ready for that. It's too much of an economic stake for all these countries with China. But watch what happens if the Sino-Russian relationship really moves in directions we don't see now, but in a much more of an alliance. Then I think there would be a real possibility of a kind of global alliance network. We don't see that yet. What we see now with Ukraine is that Xi Jinping is 100% behind Putin on propaganda and narratives. 100%, including the Chinese official response to Finland and Sweden joining NATO was, this is part of an American plot to contain China and Russia. So 100% in with Putin on propaganda and narrative, partially supportive economically, but not to the point of risking sanctions, and not supporting Putin militarily, but in part because the Biden administration's constantly engaging Beijing with warnings not to do it. So we'll see. It would be foolish for Xi Jinping to throw his lot in with Putin any more than he has, but if that happened, I think you might see more of an expansion of NATO to the Pacific or something new. Let me ask you another set of questions, Gorana. Stephen Chase from the conference room and a couple of people actually in the Q&A button asked about the significance of NATO for what we're seeing in the Pacific Islands, the Chinese Security Pact with the Solomons. Obviously, France has historic interests, the largest EEZ. One of the questioners points out that the rule of law in the Pacific Islands is based on the British system, so Britain has an important role to play. But what do you think the role is for NATO and Europe in dealing with the Pacific Islands? And could it even potentially be a mission area for NATO given France's interests there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think when it comes to engagement with the Pacific Islands, this will be done, I think, more through the EU than NATO. NATO, as much as it is, a kind of platform also for coordination and cooperation around issues that aren't necessarily in the traditional kind of domain of security, hard security. It also has some limits as to what it can do and what it's able to do. So, that's not to say that in cases of, say, disaster relief or crisis management, it can't be called upon. It definitely has that ability, and it has previously been deployed for kind of out of area operations in that context. But what I think is much more significant is the way in which we are going to see European Union step up its involvement in the Indo-Pacific. And obviously now with a growing number of member states overlapping in their membership in both NATO and the European Union, we might expect a lot more, again, in terms of contributions to, say, big infrastructure projects. There's already a lot of appetite for, we've heard a lot of these announcements, whether they are the Blue Dot Network or Build Back Better World or Global Gateway on part of the European Union. So I think that this is probably the space to watch the most. And again, just from some of the conversations that I've had with the officials from Europe, I think that there is a recognition that there needs to be a change in the approach that the West collectively has towards the Pacific Islands, primarily in the way that they don't necessarily, come up with a plan, this is how we help you in a way, but a lot more about listening to actually what the needs are and having those partners propose what it is that they need. And obviously with all of the announcements overnight, what's happening in this space, we are going to see a lot more competition, the systemic competition spill over onto these mostly island states.
And the systemic competition is as much economic, diplomatic as it is military. And of course, the NATO Charter doesn't require NATO countries to defend France in the Pacific or Britain in the Falklands. That's not how it was designed. So it would be quite a new step to have this out of area obligation extend to the Pacific. But in areas that you mentioned, economics and so forth, there's a lot of scope for cooperation in what is still not a military contest with China. Thankfully, it's a contest for influence and norms and economic rulemaking. I have more questions, but they're good, but they're huge. So I think we better end.
I think so too. It's 3 minutes to the top of the hour, so yeah.
So as Rudyard Kipling said, the East is East, the West is West, and never the twain shall meet. But Gorana, the twain have met. I really do think there are real uncertainties about domestic politics in France, in the U.S., frankly, and in the Pacific. But the forces of world history really do seem to be pushing NATO and America's Pacific allies closer together in a way we've really not seen, certainly not, in our recent memory. So your work is going to be really interesting and really important. And I, for one, will keep following it closely. So thank you very much. Let me conclude by inviting everyone to join us for a discussion of what it will mean to have a Kennedy in Canberra. Caroline Kennedy will be the United States ambassador to Australia. I got to know her well when she was ambassador in Japan. She was terrific. And we'll have a panel of experts on American politics and diplomacy and the U.S.-Australia alliance to think through what it means to have a Kennedy, an experienced diplomat, a very high profile and very effective diplomat. And what should be on the agenda for Ambassador Kenny when she comes to Canberra? We are giving free advice, and I'm sure she'll be interested. So join us on May 31st. You can see the information up on the screen now. Gorana, thank you. Terrific discussion. I look forward to many more when I move down under. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, great chatting, and look forward to the Kennedy Roundtable.